Will democracy survive the next couple of years?
Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and medi-spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now, in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence, with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
And welcome back, Access Democracy viewers. After 20 months, we are back, and I'm so excited. My name is Chris Crutchfield, and I am sitting in for the great Alan Miller. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill. I'm going to try and do it as best I can. What I'm most excited about is our guest today, Mr. Michael Belton. And Michael Belton is a longtime Minnesota resident. He's an elder, he's a leader, he's a champion, and I'm proud to say he's my friend. Michael, besides the love of his life, Linda, his great passion is the children of our community. He has spent the bulk of his career working in juvenile justice and justice reform. He has worked for local governments. He has worked nationally. He's even testified before the Congress. And so, of course, the topic for today is going to be juvenile justice and what the best outcomes are for both our kids and our community. And I'd like to thank you so much for being here, Michael.
It's great to be here, Chris.
So how long have you worked with in juvenile justice?
A little over 40 years.
Really?
Yeah.
And how did you get started?
I got started purely as an act of desperation. I got kicked out of college, and I needed a job, and there was a job posting for a corrections counselor. This was with the state of Minnesota. And being new to government and new to the job market, period, the adult job market, I was not used to euphemisms. Corrections counselor turned out to be a guard. So
How old were you at the time?
I was 21 years old.
21 years old, and they gave you a post as a correctional officer, as a guard, huh?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. At the time, Minnesota had this commissioner of corrections that was a reformer, and his name, I forget his name, but he had a PhD. He was a big deal nationally, and he was a big deal in Minnesota. And he started the correctional counseling series, and he started the Corrections Academy, and of which I was a member of the first cohort.
Got it.
Yeah.
So where were you? Were you at Stillwater, St. Cloud, or Oak Park Heights? What facility were you at?
Well, after I graduated from the academy, I was assigned to a post at St. Cloud Reformatory, the Greystone Mansion.
The big one there is you come in on Highway 10, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So tell me about that. What was that like?
Well, it was difficult. It was an incredible experience in one sense, and but it was difficult. It was scary. I was the first and only African American guard at the time, and that presented all kinds of challenges, not the least of which was with the other guards. I also had a decidedly, I don't know how to say this, but I didn't have that harsh punitive approach that many of the guards had. As a matter of fact, I told my supervisor, or sergeant, that I was to do not post me on the wall. I'm not going to shoot somebody for doing what seems to be most natural, and that's getting the heck out of a cell. And so my career was off to a sterling start.
So how did you transition from being a guard or a counselor, as they called it at St. Cloud, to working with children?
Well, I took a bit of a circuitous route. The whole time, the 9 months I spent at St. Cloud, I was trying to get out of there. It was not a good fit.
You were trying to escape yourself.
Exactly, exactly. And as someone once said, I think it was either an old incarcerated person or an old guard, who said, Michael, everybody in the prison, guard or inmate, does time. And it was that was one of the great truths that I gleaned from that experience. But as a result of some things and some positions I took and some things that happened, I wound up working back in downtown Minneapolis after 9 months, working in an experimental program called the Restitution Center. And this was working with adults, getting adult incarcerated men out of the prison to work up a restitution contract with their victims. These were all property offenders, and getting them a job and all of that.
So this was working with men coming out of St. Cloud or out of correctional institutions?
Stillwater.
Out of Stillwater,
right.
Who had done property offenses where they would work out a restitution where they try and pay back or do some sort of restorative justice with the victims they'd hurt?
Right, exactly.
Going back to St. Cloud and these men, what did you learn? What sort of things did you learn from the inmates and from these guys?
Well, I found that the incarcerated men at St. Cloud that I dealt with were some of the most well-read and most creative and imaginative people I'd ever met in my short life at that time. These guys had lots and lots of time to read. They were very curious about the world and very curious about literature, and for the African American incarcerated men, they were very curious about the Black Power movement, about religion, and about societies in general. And these men were very well read and had hours to kind of hone their arguments and their thoughts in conversation with each other. And then, because of my age and curiosity and education to that point, I got drawn into their conversations and got drawn into their circles.
Did that create any tension between you and the other counselors or correctional officers?
It did a bit, but also it helped quite a bit. I found myself as being in a position of being able to translate the experiences of the incarcerated men to the other correctional officers in more benign and humane terms, and vice versa.
Wonderful.
So it worked out very well, but it was some additional stress that I was willing to take on because of my unique role and positioning.
So then you do escape St. Cloud and you end up in Minneapolis, and you're doing some restorative justice with men coming out of Stillwater. What did you learn there? Tell me about that.
I learned so much. That experience pretty much in some ways launched an aspect of my career. But the big things that I learned, the biggest thing that I learned was I needed to go back to school and finish my education. There was this glass ceiling, and that I couldn't break through unless I had a bachelor's. And so after another year and a half of working, I decided to go back to college and finish up my degree. But along the way, I learned the value of working in a team, that there's nothing like working in a team of like-minded folks, and I mean not in lockstep, because we were a multi-ethnic group of people running that program, and multi-layered in terms of our educational experience. We had a couple of PhDs who were running the program in the experimental design, and they were from the University of Minnesota. We had a couple of master's level supervisors who were longer term employees of the Department of Corrections, and then there was a bunch of us sort of worker bees from the community working in the program. So yeah, but I learned a lot about how to function in a team. I got some real good cues about how to lead a team, and what was important. And then I think most importantly is that every team has their moment in the sunshine, and then if they're successful, they break up because they find themselves with all kinds of different opportunities. Sure. My opportunity was to go back and finish up.
So you go back and finish up, and then how do you end up working with youth?
Well, I decided that while I was working with adults, that it was easier. It was probably easier and better for me to start with youth rather than young adults or even older adults, because I had a couple of men on my caseload, a few men on my caseload who were older than I was at the time. So at any rate, I decided I wanted to work with kids. And so as I was putting together my little plans for after college graduation, it included working with youth, and I applied at Hennepin County. Also wanted to work in Hennepin County. I was no longer interested in working with the state, and they weren't particularly interested in having me work with them. So by mutual agreement, I decided to go elsewhere.
So what are some changes that you've seen? Because that was back in the late 70s, early 80s. Early 70s. Yeah. So between now, so that's been almost 50 years, over 50 years. Yeah. What sort of changes have you seen in juvenile justice?
Well, the biggest change that I witnessed with my very own eyes was just a hardening of the juvenile justice system. When I started out, it was about delinquent or incorrigible youth that wouldn't go to school, youth who wouldn't follow their parents' rules. But over time, and certainly this started in, I believe in the mid-'80s, maybe a little bit later, but over time, things hardened up. There was a real emphasis on locking youth up. There was a greater emphasis on putting them in out-of-home placement facilities. And I was working in one at the time. I was working at the Hennepin County Home School, and sending youth out of the state of Minnesota and out into greater Minnesota. So a lot of separation of youth from their families and their communities. And the dialogue, the narrative about these youth had changed. And this was part of a national pattern of the super predator, which usually meant hardened youth of color, black and brown youth, who, as the narrative went, had no regard for rules, authority, or human life. So it was things like that and then the whole birth and then growth of mass incarceration changed everything.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. A lot of times when I talk to people who don't work in corrections about juvenile corrections or juvenile justice, they equate it to parenting. How is juvenile justice different than parenting?
Well, in a sense, I'm the last person to ask that question. I don't have children. And so, but there are several key things that are different. First of all, parents raise their youth within the context of a home and a family. Corrections handles youth in terms of institutions and caseloads. I think one of the key factors that parents, I think, extend to their children in one way or another is love. And the key factor in corrections is professionalism, some idea of professionalism. And so I think you go from the difference is you go from what could be a warm, loving situation to something that's very structured and in a lot of ways devoid of love, because professionals aren't supposed to love the people they're dealing with. And instead of raising, juvenile corrections is about treating. And treatment is always about is always based on a deficit model. What's wrong? Mm-hmm. And how can we cure? Instead of saying, what's good about this youth and how can we enhance the positive, it's more about how can we correct the negative.
So tell me about some of the good things that have happened recently in juvenile corrections. Some of the stuff that you worked on, and some of the things that have been happening recently with reform initiatives.
Well, in order to talk about the good stuff, I have to talk a little bit about the bad stuff. But one of the great things that has happened is a whole emphasis on using data to make decisions, or data decision making, or data-driven decision making. And one of the strategies, one of the most popular strategies, was, I think, initiated about 22, maybe 25 years ago by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And that was centered on reducing the number of youth in juvenile detention. And it follows when you think about it, but the fewer youth who are available in your juvenile detention center who go to court from jail, the fewer youth that wind up in out-of-home placements. Uh-huh. And wind up in the fewer youth who are likely to be put on long-term probation.
So what is out-of-home placement for people who have never heard that, who don't work what is that?
That's any place where the court orders the youth to be that's outside of their home.
For example?
For example would be the Hennepin County Home School, the Ramsey County Boys Totem Town, the state juvenile facilities. And when I started, there were several around the state, but the one that remains is the Juvenile Corrections facility in Red Wing, Minnesota. There are a number of national private juvenile facilities. One of the most infamous is in Pennsylvania, where many jurisdictions send their youth to that facility.
So what does the public get wrong about youth and juvenile corrections?
I'm not so sure that the public gets things wrong necessarily, but one of the things that I have always found to be curious about corrections in general, and specifically juvenile corrections, is that most of corrections and justice is built on an out of sight and out of mind kind of philosophy. Yeah. When you look at adult prisons around the state and around the country and around the world, very few societies locate their prisons in the communities that the incarcerated people come from. Mm-hmm. They're usually, most prisons are populated by people from urban centers, mm-hmm. and the prisons themselves are built, staffed, and maintained in rural areas. So there's a big, huge disconnect. And that disconnect serves a whole bunch of purposes, some of them well-intentioned and many of them not so well-intentioned.
Can you give me some examples?
Well, the big, yes. Study after study has shown that youth who wind up in out-of-home placement and wind up and spend any significant time in an incarcerated situation, their life course trajectory are warped and bent towards a direction of continued incarceration and really, really poor health, educational, and just overall life course outcomes. They just tend to be bent towards the negative. Unfortunately, youth find themselves sexually, psychologically, physically, and emotionally abused. in these facilities, and some of these youth actually die due to neglect, unfortunate experiences, as well as the fact that you have many youth who are congregated usually in smaller spaces with little to do, sometimes a lot to do, but at any rate, the risk of injury is increased, and sometimes youth suicide. Now, youth suicide, unfortunately, in their homes as well as their community settings, but they also suicide in these facilities.
So I get notifications on my Ring all the time. There's people taking catalytic converters and carjackings, and crime is on the rise. And because of COVID, things have gone crazy. Have we gone too far? I mean, what do we need to do to keep our streets and keep our neighborhoods safe and address these issues?
Well, unfortunately, there's no one thing that's going to solve these problems. I will tell you that my experience is that most of the youth who wind up in corrections are youth who have been abused, and one of the most deadly and most horrendous forms of abuse is neglect. Mm-hmm. These youth have, many of these youths have experienced all kinds of traumatic events with no help in getting them to sort of get over or rehabilitate beyond these traumatic events. Many of these youth don't know how to read, not all, but some. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, too many. So many of them are undereducated. And I think that what people don't understand is that throughout all of this, these youth, I don't care what they've done, how they've, and what kind of harm they've visited on the community of other human beings. I do care about that. But throughout all of that, these youth are still children. And frequently that's what's forgotten. That's what's left out of the mix, because we are, as a community, and in some ways it's entirely understandable, that we become so enraged and so hurt by what some of these youth have done that we forget that they're young, that they're children, and that instead of the worst of what we can provide them, they deserve the best, because they're going to be with us for a long, long, long time, unless we can help them turn that corner. And unfortunately, because of that anger and because of this othering that we do as a society, when I mean by othering, it's not our child. Mm-hmm. And frequently the child that is considered to be other is someone who doesn't look like the people who are making these judgments. Mm-hmm. And so they tend to be black and brown youth or BIPOC.
Do you think that there's a difference in the way that law enforcement interacts in the urban area versus the suburban versus the rural area?
It entirely depends on who's being treated. And so I think there are some differences. I think in the urban areas that law enforcement tends to have quite a bit more of an edge to it, but not exclusively. I mean, we've seen youth, particularly recently, who have been either abused or killed by suburban law enforcement officers.
So you think it's more dependent on what the child looks like than whether they're in downtown Minneapolis or Edina or Little Falls?
I'm just going to speak real, Chris. I'm just going to say that I think history has shown us, certainly the recent history, but even long back to 1619, that the color, that race makes it different. And it's no accident that it's black and brown youth and adults who receive the most brutal version of what law enforcement has to offer. And it's no incident that black and brown people tend to have the worst health and life indicators in our society. That's by design.
So Are there things that you want the viewers of Access Democracy to know about children and about juvenile justice?
Yeah, there are a bunch of things that I want them to know, but I'm more interested in maybe offering a strategy.
Okay.
And that is ask questions. Show up to community meetings. But ask questions with a particular spirit. Ask questions of inquiry. Be curious about what the detention center is and why it's there and who's in there and who's staffing the detention center. And be curious about what is probation, what is parole, what does out-of-home placement mean? How much do we spend on all of these so-called services? What is the model of change that animates whatever is being done in these places and by these services? Be curious and be good consumers of this. Don't let this out of place, out of mind control what you see and what you don't see.
So I've heard people say, lock them up and throw away the key. But aren't most of the people that we lock up coming back out and coming back out to their old neighborhoods? And so how does that inform what we do? The other thing that I heard at Georgetown was that 70% of juveniles involved in crime, if we just don't touch them, their brains will develop and they'll go on and live law-abiding lives. How do you react to both of those?
What was the first thing?
Lock them up and throw away the key.
That doesn't work. Well, let me say that it's not a good strategy for public safety, and it's not a good strategy for decent human development. And I think underneath it all, we all tend to know that. And the reason why I say we all tend to know that is lock them up and throw away the key is rarely applied to white youth, both male and female. So the youth that we care about, we don't take that approach.
We need more love, is that right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps up our time.
Okay.
I would like to thank you for tuning in to Access Democracy. I'd like to thank Alan Miller for letting me sit in. I would absolutely like to thank Michael Belton for his time today. And I want you to have a great day, have a great week, and stay safe. Thank you.